one of the most important points that Stan makes in his book is that if we want to have any hope of surviving global warming and could add avoiding nuclear war, there's going to have to be a major change in consciousness. That people are going to have to think differently about what it means to have a decent, fulfilling life. Very sharp change. Is it going to be piling up as many commodities as you can in the back room, or is it going to be a world of mutual support, mutual aid, living comfortably, but without the overwhelming pressures to accumulate more? Which will it be? But you can't move to change of consciousness until you pass a first barrier, that is recognition that there's a problem. Have to do that first. Now, we may not like it, but we happen to be living in a country that's an outlier. A large part of the population doesn't see a problem. A large part of the population is tuned to a malignant duo in the White House and in the Murdoch press. Now, what they hear echoing each other is, there's no problem, don't worry about it, it's all a liberal hoax, let's just go ahead and doing what we're doing. And they're trying to undermine the Savior who we adore, but forget about it. If there's a very clear lesson here, if this goes on for 4 more years, the possibilities of change of consciousness or of dealing with the growing crisis are very seriously impaired. So unless we can overcome this malignancy, we can, but it's not certain. The chances of doing the kinds of things that Stan is recommending are going to be very sharply reduced, maybe made impossible.
Stan, if you could lay out for us exactly what you think needs to happen as the government and Congress votes on trillions of dollars being spent. Where do you think the recovery needs to be? What would be your ideal of what would happen that you could never even have predicted as you were writing this book? How do we turn this around? Let's begin with Stan and then back to Noam.
Well, I agree with a lot of the folks involved with the Green New Deal that these trillions of dollars of spending, if they are spent on the old ways of doing things, old infrastructure, et cetera, it'll create a lot of jobs, but we will have actually added to the climate emergency. Rather, they're saying with good reason that we should put that money to create new jobs, put it into building more renewable energy and green infrastructure. And that's the green part of the Green New Deal. Then there's the New Deal part of the Green New Deal with the economic and justice provisions. All of that is there's really very little to disagree with in that part. The green part of the Green New Deal, building up renewable energy, green infrastructure, that is incomplete, because simply building more solar and wind capacity is not by itself going to drive fossil fuels out of the economy. New sources of energy tend to very much add to the total energy supply without displacing older forms of energy. What we're going to need is a direct mechanism, statutory cap on the total number of barrels of oil, cubic feet of natural gas, and tons of coal that can come out of the ground and into the economy in a given year. And this is not cap and trade. You might rather call it cap and squeeze, because that limit on the amount of fossil fuel coming in will have to be lowered rapidly year by year, as much as 5 to 10% of our current consumption taken out of the supply every year to get the quantity of fossil fuels down to zero on whichever deadline you want to pick, for IPCC or the United Nations emissions gap report, but it's going to be in that range, 5 to 10% every year. Now, if we do that and it's successful and it's an impervious cap, the buildup of solar and wind and other renewable energy, green infrastructure, will not be able to increase as the amount of energy available as fast as the fossil fuel needs to be taken offline. So we're going to need to be planning for living with diminishing quantity of energy during this transition and probably beyond. That sounds horrible, but you look, we use about twice as much energy per person as most countries in Europe, about 7 times as much per person as the per capita consumption in the continent of South America. We can live on much less energy and have an even better life.
I just wanted to apologize to our audience. I'm having a little trouble hearing our guests, but we're doing the best that we can. I wanted to ask Noam Chomsky how the climate crisis, compounded with COVID, compares to previous challenges. And if you can expand on if you see any opportunities now in how to change the world and what direction we would go in. When I last saw you in Boston a few months ago, as we were it was a year ago, as we were celebrating your 90th birthday at a big event where people were welcoming you back to your hometown after you had been away for years, you were talking about the New Deal and what it meant. But if you could go back in time and share that analysis.
The threat of environmental catastrophe, along with the threat of nuclear war, are new in human history. There have never been such threats. We are facing the threat of virtual extinction, the elimination of organized human society in any form remotely like what we've known. So, for example, nuclear war is kind of obvious. If there's a nuclear war, we're basically finished. Okay, it's no escape. Some people will live, but won't be worth living. If with environmental catastrophe, we have to face the fact that we're approaching a period of global heat, which is rather similar to about 125,000 years ago, though we're approaching it much faster now than happened then. There could be nonlinear escalation, which gets out of sight, but we're approaching it. And at that time, the sea level was about roughly 25 feet higher than it is today. So try to imagine a world like that. It's unimaginable. We're approaching a world in which, if things continue on their present course, latest scientific analyses suggest a large part of the world will simply be inhabitable in 50 years or so. South Asia, a lot of the Middle East, much of Africa. What happens to all the people there? I mean, these things are almost unimaginable. It has to be terminated quickly, or we're basically finished as far as organized human society is concerned. This is totally unlike any challenge that has existed in human history. I mean, you asked about my childhood, 1930s. It was then a very grim period. The threat of fascism, Nazism, was spreading over Europe. It seemed inexorable. It seemed that there's no way out. Turns out now, we didn't know it then, that the US government was also anticipating that the coming war would end with the Germans in control of Eurasia, all of it, and the US controlling the rest of the world. Couldn't know that as a child. In fact, it wasn't public, but you could see that it was pretty awful. This is much worse. The Nazis controlling the world is an indescribable horror, but organized society disappearing is much worse. We should recognize that. This current generation has to face challenges of a kind that never were faced before. Now, to turn to the New Deal, it's worth remembering what happened. It does carry lessons for the kinds of things that Stan was talking about just now and in his book. In the 1920s, the U.S. labor movement was destroyed. It was a very vibrant, lively, militant movement. It had been destroyed by state corporate force, often direct violence. Final blow was Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. It was a Gilded Age, geared to consumption for the very rich, massive corruption, not unlike today in many ways. 1929, the Depression hit. It was pretty awful. We may be returning to something like that, but it was much worse than anything that exists today. Much worse, except in some areas like the Dust Bowl. The agricultural system was collapsing because of the kinds of policies that Stan is deploring. Just do everything you can to make money. If we wipe out the Midwest agriculture, it's somebody else's problem. Well, it was everybody's problem, it turned out. Dust storms from the devastated areas were reaching the East Coast. My family was first generation immigrant, mostly working class, mostly unemployed in those days. By the mid 30s, around 1934, things began to change. The labor movement reconstituted. The CIO was being organized. There were militant labor actions taking place. Some of them got to the level of sit-down strikes. A sit-down strike is a very serious threat to the ownership class. It's saying, look, we don't need you. We can get rid of you. We'll run these factories by ourselves, which is probably correct. They could probably do it better. But that threat is serious. There was a fairly sympathetic administration. There were not just labor, but political parties were organizing and so on. There was a reaction. The New Deal was very significant. Didn't change its basic structure of the society, but it developed programs which engaged people to deal with the problems at hand. It offered hope. So just to be concrete, take one example, several of my aunts were seamstresses, unemployed seamstresses, but they had a life. The life was in ILGRU, the labor union. For one, it was not just labor organizing. It was mutual support. It was meetings. It was educational programs, thinking what we can do, concerts, weaken the country, a whole life. We can construct a life for ourselves based on the union movement. And this was true. And in fact, the general feeling at the time, not the kind of parts of the country that John Steinbeck was talking about, but New York and the eastern manufacturing areas, there was a sense of hopefulness. We can get together, we can get out of this somehow. It's quite different from now. Now there's fear, disillusionment, hatred of institutions, distrust in one another. But it can be overcome. It took about 5 years to overcome it in the Depression period. We can't wait that long. The problems are too dire, but it showed that it could be done. So and I think we see signs of those forces developing. So the activist movements that were kind of brought together under the umbrella of the Sanders movement, which also inspired others, has had a big impact. The Sanders campaign was an enormous success, unprecedented success. It's shifted the entire arena of discussion, policy making, well to the left, things that were unthinkable, like the Green New Deal a couple of years ago, are now center of even the legislative program, certainly discussion. That's an enormous change, and it happened through direct popular activism. Lots of it, but at the peak was what the Sunrise Movement accomplished, just by sitting in congressional offices and making it impossible to ignore. Support from young legislators, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, others who came in on the Sanders wave, moved things. It can be done again, but it has to be done, and quickly. If we face another year, another 4 years of this malignancy in the White House, it's not going to happen. We've got to get rid of that. Then prospects open up, and there are many things that can be done. It's even happening on the international scale. It's worth not getting any attention here, but in Europe it is. It's quite important. There's a new Progressive International, which you know about, which was just, its opening announcement was about a week ago. Its first major event will be in September in Iceland, international meeting. Iceland, because the Prime Minister of Iceland is one of the founders of this movement. It includes since initiated by the Sanders campaign here, by DM25, Yanis Varoufakis's organization across Europe, bringing in people from Asia, Africa, and so on, dedicated to trying to come out of this crisis with the kind of world that Stan was describing, a world which is not geared to profit for a few and meaningless objects, traffic jams, and so on, undermining our lives here, but to a decent, productive, satisfying life at a level that's sustainable, with overcoming the gross, incredible inequalities and repression, which were always there, but were intensified under the 40 years of the neoliberal plague. That's what it's committed to. Unfortunately, it's barely known in the United States. You don't find articles about it in the New York Times, not surprisingly, but it's there, and we can make it real. But we have to, it's going to take plenty of work, engagement. Stan, in his book, estimates that I think it's about a third of the population will have to have a significant reduction in consumption levels, something like that. That's not going to be easy to accomplish. That third of the population are not people living in slums. They're in the power centers. They wield the power in the country. And to tell them, you're going to have to face reality. It's not going to continue. It's like telling people telling the rich and powerful in the 1930s, you're going to have to accept unions. You're going to have to accept Social Security. You're going to have to accept worker activism, decent wages and safety conditions. This is the same escalated. They were compelled to do it because the only alternative they had was losing everything. the workers would just take over the factories. They're done. It's a very fragile system of control. It's based on consent. If the consent breaks, it collapses, and there are many options. So I think that's the kind of struggle we're facing today, actually on an international scale, escalated in character because what's at stake is so much greater, but sort of the same in its general nature. And we have to be prepared for that. It's going to be a major struggle.
Stan Cox, in your book, The Green New Deal and Beyond, you have a chapter called Off Ramp Ahead. And I'm wondering if you can talk about just that off ramp from the fossil fuel economy, putting the US on an energy diet, what that means in light of what's happening today, and what the paths are you see, whether or not President Trump remains in office or whether there is a Democratic administration.
Well, we've seen in the news just today that the rate of world carbon dioxide emissions has dropped by 17%, which is pretty astounding. Of course, many people have paid the price in suffering and misery for that to happen. We have to do it. We have to, first of all, resolve not to restore the kind of economy that would start the upward march of emissions again, but rather to have a much more orderly, humane reduction in greenhouse emissions and in general ecological damage. So when and Noam is right that it's got to be different people in Washington come January, and we'll just say when that happens. Then once if as I was saying, we have a cap on gas, oil, and coal, and it starts going down, and we are living on this leaner energy diet. That's going to require a number of things. We'll need a mechanism to steer energy and resources away from wasteful and luxury production and toward producing essential goods and services. Now, if that may sound downright un-American, but America did just that during World War II. Often World War II is used as an example for the climate movement because of the big increase in productive forces and so forth for the war effort, and with an analogy to buildup of a green economy. But I think the more important lesson is that when faced with sudden scarcity, and that time it was because of the war, this time it would be voluntary with regard to energy, that the economy and society was almost totally transformed. You had the War Production Board, who were very much micromanaging production and so forth. And then because people, and this will probably be necessary again, to make sure that all households have fair share of access to energy and other resources, will probably require price controls and rationing. And we've done all this stuff before, and there are current strategies that have been worked out in the present day to do it again. Probably the most comprehensive and detailed is the climatemobilization.org, who have a very extensive plan for dealing with a future in which we're cutting back on the throughput of resources through society, and how to make that humane and just, and um, and um, and then in addition to that, we have the Green New Deals, um, uh, the parts of the Green New Deal that are dealing with guarantee of jobs or incomes or workplace democracy, human rights, and I would add universal basic services, right, rather than just Medicare for all. All essential services are guaranteed to everyone. So we're going to need all of that. And as I said, maybe the nation is now, at least the part of the nation that will, the vast majority of people who would benefit from that, will be ready to accept it. But it will recover. The 33%, you're right, that's going to be a tougher sell, and they hold the power. But we've seen with the blossoming of the climate movement over the past couple of years that, and I think anything will be possible.
We're going to go to questions from people who are listening and watching all over the world. There are now 1,500 people on Crowdcast and on Democracy Now!, thousands more. But I do want to ask Noam just a larger question about President Trump, how you would assess him right now. As people watch the leader of this country, we are not far here in New York City from Times Square, where Eugene Jarecki has erected the Trump death clock, not to be confused with the debt clock. But what President Trump has done in the midst of this catastrophe?
Well, actually, as you know, there is a famous clock, the Doomsday Clock, set every January by leading groups of scientists, political analysts, assess the state of the world and place the minute hand a certain distance from midnight. Midnight is nice to know you, goodbye. It started in 1947, right after the atomic bomb oscillated over the years. But when Trump was nominated, as soon as he was elected, the minute hand went very close to midnight, almost as close as it's ever been. After he'd been a year in office, it went as close as it's ever been to midnight. This year, it went beyond where it's ever been. In fact, the analysts abandoned minutes and moved to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. Now that's one assessment of the Trump administration. Now you can get another assessment anytime you open the newspapers. Let's take this morning. Let's imagine that we had an independent press, which was describing things the way they are. Okay, what the headlines would say is Trump decided, in order to improve his electoral prospects, to kill uncountable numbers of people in Africa, Yemen, and Latin America. That was the news that came on Twitter last night. Well, it wasn't reported quite like that, but that was the essence. That was the content of what was reported. What it said was he's going to get rid of the World Health Organization unless it does some ludicrous things which have nothing to do with reality. And what happens if you get rid of the World Health Organization? I mean, there are huge numbers of people in Africa and Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, other poor countries, who depend on World Health Organization services for survival. All sorts of diseases. WHO is saving them. Coronavirus is going to hit them much worse than it hits the developed world, far worse. So Trump is saying on his Twitter account, let's slaughter them, because maybe it'll improve my electoral prospects. Now, that's what the headlines ought to have been saying. You can take a look at what they actually said. It's essentially that content. This is every day. I happen to be talking about this morning. What can we expect from? We have a malevolence that has taken over the administration of a kind that the world has never seen. There have been people doing hideous things, but no one committed, dedicated with passion to the destruction of human society. And that's what it means to say, let's race on with more fossil fuels, let's open up new territories for expansion, let's maximize the use of coal, let's eliminate the regulations that are providing some constraint on this. Let's do anything that matters in order to get me elected and powerful. That's the reality of what we're facing, and the world sees it. It's very clear, but they can't do anything about it because the power is here. People talk about American decline, but they're not looking at the facts. The United States may be disliked, even hated, but it's feared, especially in the hands of someone like Trump. So take, say, Iran. Trump decided that for his own personal gain, he would eliminate the agreement with Iran that was working very effectively. American intelligence agrees to limit any potential threat of running nuclear weapons. So let's tear it up. And let's impose harsh sanctions to make the people, not the regime, to make the people suffer as much as possible. Because somehow, of course, it doesn't bother us. We torture people, that's fine. But maybe they'll exceed their demands. Europe dislikes it, hates it. They go along with it. They can't help it. Otherwise, they get tossed out of the international financial system. Now, of course, Europe could take another path, but they're not ready for it, and nor is the rest of the world. That's the reality that we face. That places an enormous burden on Americans. We are the source of this malignancy. Of course, it gives an opportunity to. It means we can change the world in a way that nobody else can. That's a tremendous gift, but you have to take it. If you let it go to waste, we're done for.
I wanted to bring in some questions from the audience. Myra Craig asks, how can we seize this moment? A moment in time due to COVID-19 when our skies are cleaner and traffic is bearable. We need to keep the skies cleaner like this from now on. What can I do as a citizen activist? Stan, Myra asks.
We can, it's funny, when I submitted the manuscript of this book, the pandemic was just about to start, and in there I was talking about a lot of things that people can do, including joining these movements like Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise, and one of the things I was talking about was kind of a consumption strike, and saying it's hard to imagine, but just imagine what the power would be of an almost complete strike against any air travel or driving of private cars. And little did I know, and as I wrote it, I thought, oh yeah, right, like that'll happen, and now it has happened. So I think Myra's right that we need to look for things that have happened now and to build on those.
Let me ask another question. Ulrich Eckel says, the Green New Deal is firmly based on the traditional capitalist growth model. If so, what is green about it? Let's put that question to Noam Chomsky.
Well, actually, it's not based on the capitalist growth model. It's trying to undermine the capitalist growth model. Will it go as far? Got some dissenting voices here. The basic idea is to undermine the capitalist growth model, the model that says keep producing more, increase GDP, because that increases profit. Side effect of it is people have to join by consuming more. Remember, bear in mind that we're supposed to be a market economy. That's what you learn in school. But we have a huge industry in the United States, enormous industry that is dedicated to undermining markets. That's its main goal. It's called the advertising industry. Markets are supposed to be based on informed consumers making rational choices. This industry is dedicated to turning you into an uninformed consumer making irrational choices. Just go out and buy things that you don't need and you don't want because somehow you have to have them. But don't do the things you ought to do. The questioner said, we don't have any traffic jams. Right. Do we have to have traffic jams? Is it necessary to sit for hours in a day, fuming because you're in a jam? No, it's not. You can have another model. And we even came close to it. And you won't see it if you're looking at television and looking at the ads. There you say, no, you got to buy a fancier car and so on. They don't say, devote yourself to making a rational mass transportation system. You're not going to see an ad about that. That's not what the industry's for. The industry is making you irrational and uninformed. Okay? You don't have to succumb to that. So this is an attack on the capitalist growth model based on undermining markets, changing people to be subordinate to concentrated private power and their need for profit. Let's put aside all this nonsense about markets. Undermine it. We got close to that, very close. If there had been popular consciousness and activism in 2008 and 9, we could have achieved it. Obama virtually nationalized the automobile industry. It was collapsing, so the government took it over. There were choices. One choice was give it back to the former owners, maybe different faces, and have it continue to produce massive cars and have traffic jams. Of course, that was the choice that was taken. There was another choice. The government's taken over the industry. Fine. Let's turn it over to the workforce, communities, have them deliberate on what kind of a world do you want to live in. Do you want to live in a world with traffic jams and fossil fuels that are going to destroy the next generation? Or do you want to live in a world with comfortable, effective mass transportation? The same industries could have gone that way. Well, they didn't because of the lack of popular movements forcing them to. But there's a corollary to that. It means if the popular movements exist, they can go in that direction. Okay? So we're at a turning point. It's possible. It's within reach. As I say, in 2008, it was almost in our hands. And now popular movements have grown. They can do a lot more. Not only can, but must, because decent human survival depends on that.
Yes, Stan, if you can elaborate on this, and I think this joins together with another question from Virginia Hammond, and we're going to begin wrapping up this discussion right now. But Virginia writes, our money system gives the power and privilege to create our money supply to the private bankers who created his debt. The system demands exponential growth. She writes, exploitation and transfers wealth from the many to the few without changing the money system. How do we counter this demand for continuous economic growth and its degradation of the planet?
Okay. First, the question. First, the question about the Green New Deal and growth. as it's being discussed, and we don't know what final form it'll take, but the Green New Deal does look like a massive stimulus plan. And so great care is going to have to be taken to make sure that kind of stimulus will almost always create more greenhouse emissions, more resource use, more pollution, et cetera. So the Green New Deal, that's why it also has to have this reduction, very, very steady, quick reduction in the use of fossil fuels, so that that the stimulus will then go needs and not toward simply growth in whatever industries are profitable and make the most money for the folks at the top. And as for the money, the financial system is definitely is a mess, Virginia. And we've seen even just during the pandemic here, instead of just saying, okay, till we get through this, everybody gets a certain amount of money every month for subsistence. We see all this complicated thing of going through the banks and these business owners who have to be within a certain size range, and they have to already have a relationship with banks, and it's a big mess, and we send them a lot more money than other folks get, and what other folks get, well, this last check, 1 month's rent and groceries would often eat that up. I didn't discuss in the book. I didn't discuss modern monetary theory, primarily because I had limited time to write. I didn't have time to study it thoroughly, and it's such a contentious issue. I knew whatever I said about it, one side or the other, probably both, would dismiss the rest of what I said in the book because they didn't like what I said about it. So, but I think that we do, and it's really become clear now during the pandemic that Congress does just need to appropriate money into existence to make sure that people have enough, while taxing it away from those who have too much. That's kind of an emergency measure, but we need more. It needs to evolve further as we get out of this eventually.
Finally, this is a question from Ian Brosette, Noam. He says, I'm a Sunrise Movement organizer at my local university. Things seem like they're hopeless with regards to getting things passed in this country. We've been organizing, spreading awareness, but the primary electorate chose Biden anyway. I feel like I can't vote for either general election candidate right now. You've called for Biden as a lesser evil, but how can we young people really support him? And we're going to end with that question. And I also want to let people know that we have an interview with you, Noam, that we're running on Memorial Day. So I encourage everyone to go to democracynow.org. But for this young organizer, what do you say?
What do I say? Well, first thing I would say is you've had a tremendous success. These topics weren't even discussed a couple of years ago. Now they're on the agenda. In fact, one success you've had is pressing the Democratic Party well to the left. If you read Biden's program, the DNC program, it's probably the most progressive program since Roosevelt. Not because they decided, they had a conversion and decided, yeah, we want to be leftists. It's because of the constant pressure of groups like Sunrise, many others, that have been pounding at the doors and that forced them in that direction. Exactly the way in the 1930s, major industry had to accept some degree of workers' rights, unions, conservation corps, which would rebuild what was destroyed, all kinds of things they hated, but they had to accept them. That's happened. That's a tremendous success, and it can continue. It can continue if there's a mildly responsive administration. Otherwise, you're finished. If Trump is in office, there's rock solid opposition. Furthermore, a race to catastrophe, which may even pass tipping points. Finally, staffing the entire judiciary from bottom to top with ultra-right young lawyers, which will make it impossible for at least a generation to do anything. Anything, no matter what the people want, no matter what you want, they'll block it at the judicial level. Okay? So you have a choice right now. You don't have a choice of abstaining. That's not a choice. If you abstain because I didn't get everything I wanted, then you're saying I'm taking a vote away from the opposition to Trump, which amounts to the same as adding a vote to Trump. So your choices are, do I add a vote for Trump and ensure that the worst will happen and that all my goals will be destroyed? Or do I hold my nose, take 15 minutes, push a lever, and then go back to work? That's what should be. Those are the choices. There aren't any others. It's always been the case. I mean, somebody could have said it, and some did in 1932, I'm not going to vote for this capitalist pig, Roosevelt. I don't care who it is. They're all just a bunch of capitalist pigs. So if it's Hoover, okay, who cares? Mattered a lot. In fact, the same question arose at the same time. I'm old enough to remember it in Germany. Stalin had ordered the communist parties to condemn everyone else as what were called social fascists. They're all the same. The heck with it. So I'm not going to join with the social fascists to build a unified labor movement which would confront Hitler. Who cares? They're all the same. And after them will come. Well, we saw what happened. I should say, just in my lifetime, this happened again in 1968. I forget your age, but you probably remember that. The 68, there was a choice between Humphrey and Nixon. Two capitalist pigs. I'm not going to vote. So you get Nixon and a couple of million corpses in Indochina. Well, that's the cost. I feel good, so a couple of million corpses in Indochina. Well, okay. It's a way of looking at the world, not a way I recommend. And now the stakes are much higher. The stakes are literally survival. You have another 4 years of rock solid opposition, race to catastrophe, stuffing the judiciary so that nothing will ever happen. We're in very bad shape. On the other hand, if you take what's called the lesser evil, you have an administration which could be responsive. It's already been responsive, we've seen. You go back to work, you can push it further. You can achieve the kinds of things that Stan's talking about. Those are basically the choices.
I know I said that was the last question, but Anna insists on her question being asked, and that is, can we see your dogs, Noam?
I think they ran outside because somebody came to the door and I have to scream at them. But maybe I could get the parrot to say sovereignty to all the people in Portuguese. He sometimes does it.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Known, world-renowned dissident, linguist, author of over 100 books. It's great to be talking with you again. And I want to congratulate Stan Cox on his new book, The Green New Deal and Beyond, Ending the Climate Emergency While We Still Can. And I also want to thank City Lights Bookstore and Publishers, founded by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who at 101 years old is still fighting for progressive social change through promoting important books like Stan's. So folks can get the book, The Green New Deal and Beyond. It's great being with both of you. And again, tune in every day to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. But on Monday, on Memorial Day, we spend the hour with our guest today, Noam Chomsky. Thanks all of you for being with us, and to everyone, be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.